There were many topics of conversation at the General Assembly, many of which I found very illuminating, and some concepts that were new to me. One example of this was the concept of white supremacy culture and systemic racism. When I hear the term white supremacy, I picture skinheads and neo-Nazis marching in the street, not the structure of our societal institutions set up in a way that perpetuates racism and elevates whites above everyone else. As an example of this, as a GA delegate, we voted on several actions of immediate witness. One of these actions of immediate witness that we voted on is a call to action for UUs to engage in the larger movement to end anti-Blackness and defund the police. Specifically, one of the conclusions of this AIW reads, joining in widespread calls for immediately defunding of police departments, ending immigration detention and abolishing ICE, and advocating for reinvestment in communities that have been victimized by policing and other forms of white supremacy. Defund the police. As you may imagine, this generated a lot of discussion and pushback among many of the GA participants. I too find it, certainly as a political message, a little worrisome. I worry about its effectiveness as a political message. But it really did spur me to read more and attend more presentations at the GA on policing and race relations and why the activists were saying, defund the police. I've come around to understanding the basis of their desire to radically restructure our policing system, to say nothing about the whole criminal justice system. And we as a society have decided to use police for all kinds of jobs that they are ill-suited for and in fact may make worse in some situations. Here's a great graphic I have from Temple University criminologist Jerry Ratcliffe that used 2015 police call data from Philadelphia, not exactly a low crime city. So here is the actual raw data where the area of every square is the volume of calls. And here I've actually color-coded it to make it a little easier to see. And basically what this shows is on the bottom right, the little red square on the bottom is the only part of this whole work that they do that involves violent crime. And that's actually even a little oversized because it includes all drug-related interactions, and some of those are nonviolent. The top green box is completely unrelated issues to even law enforcement at all. They're just calls or derelict vehicles or other things that even don't involve really law enforcement, law breaking. The left bottom khaki box is crowd control and domestic disputes and other minor disturbances. The box in the middle is for so this is the box I'm talking about. So you can see that this is a much smaller portion of what actually police are doing. And the white boxes here that I didn't color in are actually things that do deal with breakings of laws and so on. So my point there was that the question is, and another study I've read about is police only deal with high crime, violent crimes in places like Baltimore and New Orleans, not exactly low crime cities, about 4% of the time. So the question is, what are we really paying police to do? And what are they actually being trained to do? If the majority of their training is for the red box, perhaps there are better people more suited to handle the green and khaki parts of policing, like mental health professionals or social workers. In what situation would you call the police? This question was asked at the GA, and what I learned is that Black and brown people basically never call the police, because in many situations, police just make things worse. This struck me as a profound example of my privilege. I'm not afraid to call the police because as a white, cisgendered, upper middle class male, I benefit from white supremacy culture. I believe that the police will help. The call to defund the police by Black Lives Matter activists is a call to dismantle this system and replace it with a functioning organization that uses its resources to uplift their community rather than suppress it. So this experience made me want to be part of that solution. And sharing this with you is my first step in doing just that.
One afternoon after GA, I took a walk around my neighborhood to try to slow down the churning and buzzing in my head and let my thoughts settle down. Surprisingly, memories of my childhood rose to the surface. I thought that was odd. I have lived here in San Francisco and on the peninsula for 46 years, well over half of my life. Both of my parents have been dead for over 12 years. So even more surprisingly to me, I felt an intense and painful sense of loss. Why now? Eventually, I realized it was because of the workshop that I had attended about settler colonialism, a history of erasure and exclusion. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz told us about our origin myth of the benign settler who cleared the wilderness, put up a little log cabin, and farmed a few acres. People who thought they were fulfilling their manifest destiny by replacing ignorant savages who did not know how to properly use this bountiful land. She asked us to acknowledge our belief that the natives just genteelly and quietly disappeared to make way for all of us. Well, yeah, despite all evidence to the contrary, I guess I did actually believe that. Every year for Christmas, my favorite aunt gave me a copy of one of the Little House books by Laura Ingalls Wilder until I owned the entire set in hardback. I read them over and over, and even colored the beautiful drawings by Garth Williams. I remember celebrating the 100-year anniversary of Oregon's entry into the Union when I was in grade school. My mother, who was an excellent seamstress, sewed me a full-length Pioneer woman's dress. It had puff sleeves and ribbons and a pretty apron. She even made me a poke bonnet. I can still sing the songs I learned from memory, such as Land of the Empire Builders. Yes, that is the name of the state song of Oregon. Land of the Empire Builders, land of the Golden West, conquered and held by freemen, fairest and the best. Or wagon train rolling across the prairie, rolling onward through the storm and gale, toward the land of dreams trudge the old ox teams down the Oregon Trail. Where did Indians fit into this narrative? Well, the name Indian even sounds foreign, like they came from some country in the Middle East. Or redskins, even more alien, like little green men flopping from the sky. But First Peoples. Now that is a name to be reckoned with. Like they belong here. Like maybe this was their land and we stole it from them. What if we didn't just start farming empty wilderness? What if we all in some way drove families from their homes and killed innocent people? What if we replaced the native plants that grew and thrived here for hundreds of years with European plants that require emptying lakes and rivers of water and to survive in a dry climate? What if we had to spray pesticides that kill bees and give cancer to the very people whom the plants are supposed to feed? I grew up in Albany, Oregon, where the Calpurnia River flows into the Willamette River. If I ever learned anything about either of those two tribes, I've long forgotten it. Maybe I should do some research and find out something about the first people who lived where I grew up. And that hardly seems adequate. I wonder whether it's possible that we can acknowledge our history and learn from our mistakes. We've been running roughshod over this North American continent since we arrived here. Might we be given a chance to change our ways? Maybe the Black and brown people who are speaking up and fearlessly telling their stories can help us. Maybe it would improve life for all of us if we gave some of our tax money to support schools and medical services and lending institutions that will give other folks a chance, instead of even more heavily arming police to protect the property that we have accumulated at their expense. What if we listen to Indigenous people, many of whom were at GA and are still willing to talk to us? People who tell us to look at where we are living right now and can show us how to pay attention to wild plants and animals who also inhabit our neighborhoods and have knowledge to share. Might we go so far as to listen to somebody besides white folks for change? We have everything to lose and the world to save.
I'd like to share my reflections from GA about a specific workshop that I attended. So the workshop that most impacted me was by Dr. David Kampt and his collaborator, Allison Mahaley. It was called Anti-Racism as Spiritual Practice. Their work is based on the idea that doing anti-racism work is maybe not just political, but it is deeply spiritual work. For us, white people, to be allies that are helpful, there is deep work that we have to do to know where we are coming from, what triggers us, and what we envision creating in the world. Their approach is rooted in the UU principles and based on having compassion for each other and recognizing our interdependence. So we started off the workshop by taking the White Ally Quiz. It's a 2-question quiz to help us identify what type of ally we currently are. I was a little skeptical that 2 questions would be very revealing, but who doesn't love a self-assessment quiz? So I took the quiz, and the result didn't just give me a little deeper knowledge about myself. It really turned my understanding on its head. It was so surprising to me that I'd like to share with you the first of those 2 questions and what it revealed about my own thinking. So this is I'm going to read some statements, and you can kind of take this with me. So I'm going to read statements, and then I'll ask you the first question. Think about what happens when people do or say things that you find racially problematic. Here are a couple of example statements. Slavery and Jim Crow, forced segregation, they were a long time ago. It's time to move on and stop thinking about those things. If you just behave properly, law enforcement treats you properly. Race doesn't matter that much in how people are treated by police. And the third statement. Nowadays, there are few advantages to being white. I'm not privileged because I'm white. So the question is, what happens in your heart and mind? How often do you have a visceral response, sadness, frustration, anger, or others, when statements like this are made in your presence? This is about your internal response, not about whether you show it. Do you have a visceral reaction 2/3 of the time or more? Or between 1/3 and 2/3 of the time, or less than 1/3 of the time? My answer to that question and a second question told me which of 6 ally types I am. And the types have fairly neutral names like mental warrior, first responder, the engaged watcher. So I identified my type and read about the prescription, based on my type, what are the steps for me to take? What's my growth edge? And here it is. The work for my ally type is emotional regulation. Because I said that more than 2/3 of the time, I have a response of anger or frustration or sadness to those statements. And I felt kind of righteous in that reply. Of course, those statements bother me. Of course, I have a visceral reaction to hearing those statements. But what I learned is that when we're triggered, we're not able to connect with empathy to the speaker, to be compassionate, to see our own interconnection with the speaker of those statements. So maybe where I need to start is not with righteous anger on behalf of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, but with compassion for white people who are currently racism skeptics. And for those of you that are intrigued about Dr. Kampt's and Allison Mahaley's work, there will be a link shared in the chat box. Dr. Camp views the work of white allies to be turning around to the white people behind them and building a bridge, to admit that maybe at some point long ago, maybe we also had some form of race skepticism. Then reaching out a hand from that place of empathy to help them take the next step or two away from being a racism skeptic.
As a person who is new to Unitarian Universalism, I'm still trying to figure out what this is all about. Clearly, I have jumped in with 2 feet, but attending the General Assembly took me from our small pond to a vast ocean of UU-ness. I was most struck by the absolute passion of the leaders and the attendees about things very large and very small, and also the diversity of the people in leadership, which I don't see in our local community. Against the backdrop of the Black Lives Matter protests across the country and the world, this was particularly profound. And, as you've already heard, the anti-racism messages were loud and strong throughout the assembly. Here are some of the most salient points that I heard. The inherent worth and dignity of all shows us that one of us is not free. One body trying to move to a transformed world together. And the question is, how does we must decenter ourselves and recenter the community, move from the I to the we. Naming whiteness and its privilege among our white friends is where the real work needs to be done. And to you, my mostly white friends, I suggest that we can start here in our own fellowship by adopting the 8th principle. What, you say? There's an 8th principle? I know, that's what I said. Hey, I'm a newbie here, what do I know? But there is a proposed 8th principle, and some of you are perhaps aware of it. Here is what it states. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. I come to UUFRC for the beloved community. That is what draws me here. That is what pulls my heart towards all of you. After all that you have heard from us today, I hope you can see why dismantling racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions is of the utmost importance. Adopting the 8th principle is a step towards holding us accountable as an institution to match our actions to our values. I would like to suggest that we take this step together.